Drop the bag. Now. The voice cut through the glass lobby before her foot had fully crossed the polished threshold, sharp and certain, the kind of voice that expected obedience without question. Ava Carter stopped mid-step, the rubber sole of her travel-worn shoe barely whispering against the marble floor, the air inside the FBI headquarters cooler than outside, carrying the faint scent of metal, disinfectant, and quiet authority. Conversations died instantly. A man in a navy suit froze near the security scanner. A woman clutching a badge hesitated, her eyes flicking up and then away. The entire entrance seemed to hold its breath, suspended in that single command. Ava didn't drop the bag. She adjusted her grip instead, fingers tightening slightly around the worn leather handle, the edges softened by years of use. Not decoration, but purpose. Her coat was simple, charcoal gray, creased from hours of travel, a thin layer of dust still clinging near the hem from the sidewalk outside. Nothing about her appearance announced power. Nothing demanded attention. And yet she stood there, steady, unmoved, as if the command had passed through her without landing. The security guard stepped forward, boots firm against the floor, each step echoing just enough to remind everyone who controlled this space. Mark Reynolds had worked this entrance for over a decade, long enough to read people in a glance, long enough to trust instinct over explanation. His uniform was pressed, badge polished, posture rigid with the confidence of routine authority. He didn't see a director. He saw a disruption. I said drop it. He repeated, slower this time, his tone edged with irritation now that compliance hadn't followed. A few heads turned more openly. Someone near the back shifted, angling their phone just slightly, not obvious, but enough to capture the moment if it turned into something more. Ava lifted her eyes to meet his. Calm, clear, not defensive, not confrontational, just present. The fluorescent lights above caught in her gaze, reflecting faintly like still water, unshaken. For a brief second, something unfamiliar flickered across Mark's expression, not doubt, not yet, but a pause, a hesitation too small for anyone else to notice. Then it hardened again. Ma'am, you don't walk in here like that, he said, gesturing toward the bag. Procedure. The word landed heavier than it needed to, less instruction, more boundary. Ava exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried miles in it, early flights, long lines, years of being measured before being heard. Around her, the lobby remained frozen in quiet observation, the soft hum of the security scanner the only constant sound, steady, indifferent. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. Instead, she shifted her weight forward and took one more step inside. The movement small but deliberate, the kind that changes a room without raising a voice. The marble beneath her feet reflected faint outlines of everyone watching, a mirror of stillness and tension. Mark's jaw tightened. Control was slipping from the script he knew. Stop right there, he said, sharper now, the authority in his voice rising just enough to fill the space again. Ava stopped, but not because he had told her to. She set the bag gently on the inspection counter, the sound of leather meeting metal soft but precise, like a decision placed exactly where it needed to be. Her hand lingered there for a second, fingertips resting on the worn surface, then lifted away. She looked at him again, steady as before, and in that quiet, something shifted in the room, subtle but undeniable, as if the balance between assumption and truth had tilted, just slightly, waiting for the moment it would fully fall. The bag rested on the metal counter, untouched, as if it carried more weight than its size suggested. And for a moment no one moved, not the agents in line, not the receptionist behind the glass partition, not even the hum of conversation that usually filled the lobby during morning intake hours. Ava Carter stood with her hands now free at her sides, shoulders relaxed despite the attention settling on her from every direction, the overhead lights casting a soft reflection along the curve of her cheek and the edge of her coat. She had been in rooms like this before, though not always as the person in control, and there was a quiet familiarity in the way tension gathered before something shifted. Mark Reynolds watched her closely, eyes narrowing just enough to study details he felt he had missed, the scuffed edges of her shoes, the absence of a visible badge, the calm that did not match the situation he believed he was managing. Open it, he said, nodding toward the bag, his tone measured but firm, the kind of voice used to being followed without question. Ava did not move immediately. Instead, she glanced briefly at the scanner to her left, its green light blinking in a steady rhythm, then back at him, as if confirming something internally before responding. "You can scan it," she said, her voice even, clear, carrying just enough to reach beyond him without raising itself. A man in line shifted his weight, the faint rustle of a suit sleeve breaking the stillness. Someone else coughed softly, then stopped, as though even small sounds felt out of place in the suspended atmosphere. Mark exhaled through his nose, a subtle sign of impatience, and reached for the bag himself, fingers closing around the handle with practiced authority. The leather bent slightly under his grip, but Ava's gaze did not follow his hands. She remained focused on his face, watching, not reacting. As he placed the bag onto the scanner belt, the machine gave a low mechanical hum, the conveyor pulling it forward inch by inch beneath the arch. The screen beside it flickered to life, shapes and outlines beginning to form in muted shades of gray and blue. Mark leaned in slightly, eyes scanning the display, expecting disorder, something that would justify the interruption, the command, the certainty he had already committed to. Behind him, a younger agent stepped closer, curiosity overcoming restraint, while another pretended to check their watch, though their attention remained fixed on the unfolding moment. Ava stood still, her posture unchanged, as if time moved differently for her, slower, steadier, unaffected by the subtle rise in tension around her. A faint sound came from the far end of the lobby, the distant ding of an elevator arriving on another floor, then silence again. Mark's brow tightened as the scan continued, the contents resolving more clearly now, not chaotic, not suspicious, but organized, deliberate, the kind of arrangement that spoke of purpose rather than concealment. He tapped the screen once, then again, adjusting the view, searching for something that would confirm what he believed he already knew. Ava finally shifted her weight slightly, not stepping back, not forward, just enough to remind the room that she was still there, still present, still unmoved. "Careful," she said quietly, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a statement placed exactly where it needed to be. The word lingered in the air longer than expected, settling into the silence that followed, and for the first time since she had entered, the balance in the room began to tilt, not visibly, not completely, but enough that even those watching without understanding could feel that something was no longer aligned the way it had been just moments before. Mark Reynolds kept his eyes on the screen longer than necessary, as if staring hard enough might change what he was seeing, the glow from the scanner reflecting faintly across his face, flattening the confidence that had been there just minutes ago into something tighter, more uncertain. The outlines on the display were clean, structured, stacks of documents aligned with precision, sealed folders marked with internal classification tags. Nothing chaotic, nothing careless, everything placed with intent. It was not what he expected from someone he had already decided did not belong. He cleared his throat quietly, a small sound that felt louder in the silence, then reached forward to stop the conveyor as the bag exited the scanner. The belt slowed, then stilled, the mechanical hum fading into the background like a thought he could no longer rely on. Behind him, the younger agent leaned in slightly, eyes flicking between the screen and Ava, trying to reconcile the image with the person standing a few feet away, while another employee shifted their stance, no longer pretending not to watch. Ava remained exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, not waiting for approval, not asking for it, simply allowing the moment to unfold on its own terms. Mark lifted the bag off the conveyor and set it back on the counter, this time with less force, more care, as though the object itself now required a different kind of handling. "Identification," he said, but the word lacked the sharp edge it had carried before, softened by something he did not fully understand. Ava reached into the inner pocket of her coat, the motion unhurried, deliberate, and for a brief second every eye in the lobby followed her hand, the simple act carrying more weight than it should have. She withdrew a slim holder, dark leather, worn just enough to show it had been used often, not displayed. The fluorescent lights caught along its edge as she placed it gently on the counter between them, not sliding it forward, not pushing it toward him, just setting it there, as if the distance between them mattered. Mark hesitated before picking it up, his fingers hovering for a fraction of a second, then closing around it with a grip that was no longer entirely certain. He opened it, eyes dropping to the contents, scanning quickly at first, then again, slower, as if his mind needed more time to catch up with what his eyes had already read. A faint crease formed between his brows. The name was clear. The credentials were unmistakable. The authority embedded in those lines of text did not match the assumptions he had built moments earlier. He blinked once, then again, as if resetting his focus would change the information in front of him. It did not. The room felt different now, not louder, not more active, but heavier, as though the silence itself had shifted in meaning. The younger agent straightened slightly, posture adjusting instinctively, sensing something without fully understanding it, while the receptionist behind the glass glanced down at her terminal, fingers hovering above the keyboard but not moving. Ava watched him quietly, not with triumph, not with accusation, but with a steady awareness that seemed to see through the moment rather than react to it. Mark closed the holder slowly, the soft click of leather folding against itself, sounding far more final than it should have. He looked up at her, really looked this time, not at her clothes, not at her presence in the space, but at her. And something in his expression shifted, the certainty that had defined him just minutes ago beginning to fracture, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone. For the first time since she stepped through the door, he did not speak immediately, and in that hesitation, the balance in the room tipped further, quietly, inevitably, toward a truth that was no longer waiting to be revealed, but already standing in front of him. The silence stretched just long enough to feel deliberate, like a held breath no one wanted to release first, and Mark Reynolds stood there with the folded ID still in his hand, its weight suddenly disproportionate to its size, as if the thin piece of leather carried something far heavier than authority alone. He shifted slightly, his stance no longer as rigid as before, the certainty in his posture replaced by a subtle imbalance that he could not immediately correct. Ava Carter did not move to take the ID back. She let it remain in his hand, allowing him to sit with what he had already seen, allowing the moment to fully settle rather than rushing past it. Around them, the lobby remained suspended, the usual rhythm of footsteps and low conversation replaced by a quiet awareness that something significant had shifted, even if not everyone could name it yet. Mark finally extended the ID toward her, the motion slower than expected, almost careful, as if returning something fragile rather than routine. "Ma'am," he began, but the word caught slightly, not out of confusion, but because it no longer fit the way he had used it moments earlier. Ava took the ID without urgency, her fingers brushing the edge of the holder, steady, precise, and slipped it back into her coat pocket with the same measured calm she had carried since the beginning. She did not thank him. She did not acknowledge the delay. She simply stood there, meeting his eyes again, and in that look there was no anger, no visible frustration, only a quiet clarity that made the space between them feel smaller, more direct. Mark cleared his throat again, this time more noticeably, and glanced briefly toward the scanner as if searching for a next step that followed the rules he knew. "You can proceed," he said, gesturing toward the secured entrance beyond the metal detectors. But the gesture lacked its earlier authority, now more permission than command. Ava did not move immediately. Instead, she looked past him for a brief second, toward the corridor that led deeper into the building, the polished floor reflecting the overhead lights in long, uninterrupted lines. Then her gaze returned to him, steady as before. "Procedure matters," she said quietly, her voice even, not raised, not sharp, but carrying enough weight to settle into the silence around them. Mark nodded almost instinctively, though it was not clear whether he was agreeing or simply reacting to the tone. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, the words coming out softer than intended. Ava tilted her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the response, then added, "So does judgment." The sentence landed without force, but it stayed, lingering in the air in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Behind them, someone shifted again, the faint sound of a shoe against marble breaking the stillness. For a moment before it returned, Mark's expression tightened, not defensively, but with the slow realization that the moment had extended beyond a simple checkpoint interaction into something that reflected back on him, something that would not disappear once she walked past. He lowered his hand to his side, fingers flexing slightly, as if releasing tension, he had not noticed holding. Ava finally stepped forward, moving past the counter with a calm, unhurried pace. The sound of her footsteps soft but distinct against the floor, each step measured, each one carrying her further into the space she already belonged to. As she passed him, she did not look away, and for a brief second their shoulders aligned in the same line of sight. The distance between them reduced to almost nothing, and in that moment Mark felt something shift internally, not forced, not sudden, but undeniable. She continued toward the secured doors, the badge clipped now visible against her coat as it caught the light, and the sensor ahead gave a soft, confirming tone as she approached. Behind her, the lobby remained quiet, not frozen anymore, but changed, as if everyone present had witnessed something they would carry with them long after the moment itself had passed. And Mark Reynolds stood where he was, no longer certain that the role he had performed so confidently minutes earlier meant the same thing now that he had seen what he had almost overlooked. The soft confirmation tone from the access sensor had barely faded when the atmosphere behind Ava began to shift again, not forward this time, but inward, tightening around the man who had just moments ago controlled the entire space with a single command. Mark Reynolds remained at his post, but the position no longer felt anchored the way it always had. His feet planted on the same polished floor, yet the ground beneath his certainty no longer as solid. The younger agent who had been watching stepped back slightly, creating a subtle distance, not out of disrespect, but out of something quieter, an awareness that the moment had changed its direction and that he was now standing too close to something he did not fully understand. A faint murmur began at the far end of the lobby, not loud enough to form words, but enough to signal that the stillness had cracked, that people were beginning to process what they had just witnessed. Mark reached for the edge of the counter, his fingers resting against the cool metal surface, grounding himself in something physical as his mind replayed the last few minutes with uncomfortable clarity. The command, the tone, the assumption. Each piece returned sharper than it had felt in real time. He glanced toward the scanner screen again, though it had already gone dark, as if it might still offer an explanation that justified what had already unfolded. It did not. Behind the glass partition, the receptionist lowered her gaze to her monitor, but her posture had changed, more upright now, more attentive, as though an invisible line had been drawn across the room, and everyone had quietly adjusted their position in relation to it. Mark inhaled slowly, the breath deeper than usual, and straightened his uniform instinctively, smoothing a crease that did not need smoothing, a habit built from years of maintaining control in small, precise ways. The radio clipped to his shoulder gave a soft burst of static, then a voice, clear and official, cutting through the lingering tension. All units, be advised, Director Carter is now on site. Repeat, Director Carter is in the building. The words landed with a finality that left no room for interpretation, no space for doubt, and for a brief second Mark closed his eyes, not fully, just enough to acknowledge what he had already begun to understand. When he opened them again, the lobby looked the same marble, the same glass, the same controlled entry point, but it did not feel the same. The authority he had relied on was still there, unchanged in structure, but something in how it was applied, how it was carried, had shifted in a way he could not ignore. A man in line stepped forward cautiously, placing his bag on the counter with a quiet respect that had not been there before, and Mark responded automatically, scanning, checking, moving through the process, but his movements were slower now, more deliberate, as if each action required a level of attention he had never given it before. His voice, when he spoke, was measured, controlled, but different, stripped of the edge that had once come so easily. "Please place your items on the belt," he said, the words clear, professional, but no longer carrying the weight of assumption. The man nodded quickly, complying. Without hesitation. Behind him, the line adjusted, people stepping forward in small increments, the rhythm of the lobby beginning to return, but with a subtle change in tone, less casual, more aware. Mark processed each person carefully, eyes no longer scanning for what did not belong, but for what was actually there, the difference small but significant. And somewhere beyond the secured doors, out of sight now, Ava Carter continued deeper into the building, her presence no longer visible, yet still shaping the space she had passed through, leaving behind not disruption, but a quiet recalibration that lingered in the air, in the posture of those who had watched, and most of all, in the man who remained at the entrance, now standing not just as a gatekeeper, but as someone who had been forced, in a single moment, to reconsider what it meant to truly see the people standing in front of him. The rhythm of the lobby slowly returned, but it no longer sounded the same. The quiet clicks of shoes against marble more deliberate, the soft beeps of the scanner more noticeable, as if every small sound had been pulled into sharper focus after what had just unfolded. Mark Reynolds continued his work, checking badges, guiding visitors, maintaining the structure he had always relied on. Yet each movement carried a new weight, a hesitation that did not slow him down, but made him more aware of every decision he made. The line moved steadily, one person after another, bags placed, scanned, returned, a system functioning as it always had, but something beneath it had shifted, subtle yet undeniable. The overhead lights cast long reflections across the polished floor, stretching toward the secured doors where Ava had disappeared minutes earlier, the space she left behind still holding a quiet imprint of her presence. Mark glanced up briefly between visitors, his eyes drifting toward that corridor without fully turning his head, as if part of him remained fixed on the moment that had already passed. The radio at his shoulder was silent now, the earlier announcement settled into memory, no longer an interruption but a confirmation that had redefined everything that came before it. He reached for the next bag, guiding it onto the scanner belt with careful precision, watching as it moved beneath the arch, the familiar process now demanding a different kind of attention, not suspicion, not assumption, but awareness. The screen lit up again, shapes forming, details revealing themselves in quiet order, and for the first time in years, he found himself not searching for what might be wrong, but simply observing what was there. Behind him, the younger agent adjusted his stance, mirroring the change without realizing it, his posture more open, his gaze less guarded, as if the lesson of the moment had extended beyond a single interaction. A woman stepped forward next, her expression neutral, her hands steady as she placed her belongings on the counter, and Mark met her eyes briefly, offering a nod that was neither commanding nor dismissive, just present. She nodded back, a small exchange, simple, almost unnoticeable, yet it carried a different tone than before, one built on acknowledgement rather than control. The scanner beeped softly, the bag cleared, and he returned it without comment, the process smooth, uninterrupted. The line continued to move, the building breathing again, but beneath the surface, something had settled deeper, something that would not reset with the passing of time. Mark exhaled slowly, his breath visible only in the slight rise and fall of his chest, and rested his hand briefly against the counter once more, feeling the cool metal beneath his palm. It grounded him, not in authority, but in presence, in the awareness of where he stood and what that position required beyond routine. Across the lobby, the glass walls reflected fragments of movement, silhouettes passing, conversations resuming in low tones, yet every reflection seemed sharper, more defined, as if the space itself had become more honest. And in that quiet continuity, Mark understood something without needing it spoken, that procedure alone was never the full measure of his role, that the uniform did not grant him the right to decide who belonged, only the responsibility to ensure safety without losing sight of humanity. The thought did not arrive as a revelation, not sudden or overwhelming, but as a steady realization, settling into place with the same quiet certainty that Ava had carried when she walked through the door. The lobby continued its motion, unchanged in structure, but altered in meaning, and Mark remained at his post, no longer just enforcing the rules he had memorized, but beginning, slowly, to understand the weight of how those rules were applied, and the difference that a single moment of awareness could leave behind long after the moment itself had passed. Upstairs, the elevator door slid open with a soft mechanical whisper, revealing a corridor lined with glass offices and muted gray walls, the kind of space designed to feel controlled, precise, unquestionable. Yet as Ava Carter stepped out, the atmosphere carried a different kind of tension, one that moved quietly through people rather than around them. A few agents standing near the reception desk turned almost in unison, their conversations pausing mid-sentence, eyes locking onto her not out of curiosity alone, but recognition. the kind that spreads faster than any announcement. One man straightened his tie instinctively. Another lowered his voice, though he had not been speaking loudly to begin with. Ava walked forward at a steady pace, her steps measured, the sound of her heels soft against the carpeted floor, her posture unchanged from the moment she entered the building, calm, grounded, unhurried. A woman behind the desk stood quickly, offering a polite nod that bordered on formal, her expression composed but attentive. "Good morning, Director Carter," she said, her voice clear, respectful, and this time there was no hesitation in the title. Ava returned a small nod, not lingering, not slowing, simply acknowledging before continuing down the corridor. Behind her, the shift was immediate, conversations restarting in lower tones, glances exchanged, subtle adjustments in posture that reflected more than just awareness. They reflected understanding. The news traveled quickly, not through official channels, but through presence, through the undeniable reality of her walking past them without introduction, without explanation, and yet fully recognized. Inside a nearby office, a senior agent paused mid-conversation, glancing through the glass wall as Ava passed, his expression tightening slightly as he recalculated something internally, not about her, but about the system he operated within. Down the hall, a group of analysts stood clustered near a workstation, their screens filled with data and reports, but their attention briefly pulled away as she moved past, their eyes following for a second longer than necessary before returning to their work with a quiet focus that had not been there moments earlier. Ava did not react to any of it. She did not acknowledge the attention beyond what was required. She simply moved forward, each step carrying the same quiet authority that had unsettled the lobby below, not loud, not forceful, but undeniable. As she approached the corner office at the end of the corridor, the nameplate beside the door caught the light, polished metal reflecting the overhead fixtures in sharp, clean lines, the engraved letters unmistakable, Director A. Carter. She paused for just a moment before entering, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, the kind that comes from stepping into a role that carries weight beyond the title itself. Inside, the office was still, untouched since the previous occupant had left, the desk cleared, the chair aligned perfectly, the large window overlooking the city letting in a pale wash of daylight that stretched across the floor. Ava stepped in, closing the door gently behind her, the soft click echoing in the quiet space. She set her bag down on the desk, the same bag that had been questioned minutes earlier, and for a brief moment her hand rested on it again, fingers tracing the worn edge before releasing it. Outside, through the glass walls, movement continued, people returning to their routines, but with a subtle shift in energy, a recalibration that had already begun to ripple through the building. And far below, at the entrance, the echo of that same presence lingered, now understood not as interruption, but as a reflection of something larger, something that had always been there, waiting to be recognized. The office remained quiet for several seconds after the door closed, the kind of silence that did not feel empty but intentional, as if the space itself was waiting for something to begin. Ava Carter stood near the desk, her gaze drifting briefly toward the wide window, the city stretching beyond it in layers of glass and steel, distant traffic moving in quiet lines far below, everything continuing as it always had, unaware of the shift that had just taken place inside these walls. She exhaled slowly, then reached for the chair behind the desk, her hand resting lightly on the back before she pulled it out and sat, the motion smooth, unhurried, as if she had already been there long before this moment. The leather creaked softly beneath her, a small sound that seemed louder in the stillness, marking the transition from arrival to presence. She opened the bag and began removing the folders one by one, placing them neatly across the desk, each document aligned with precision, each movement deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant. Outside, footsteps passed in the corridor, muted, voices rising and falling, but none entered, none interrupted. The building was adjusting, finding its new rhythm around her. A soft knock came at the door, light but clear, followed by a pause, then another, more certain this time. Ava looked up. "Come in," she said, her voice steady, carrying just enough to reach the other side. The door opened slowly, revealing a man in his early 50s, suit pressed, expression composed but alert, the kind of presence that carried years of experience and careful observation. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him with quiet respect. "Director Carter," he said, inclining his head slightly, not overly formal, but intentional. Ava nodded once in acknowledgement. "Agent Mitchell," she replied, recognizing him without needing introduction. He stepped closer to the desk, his posture straight, hands loosely at his sides. "I wanted to welcome you," he said, his tone measured, though there was something beneath it, not uncertainty, but curiosity, perhaps even respect forming in real time. Ava gestured toward the chair across from her. "Sit." He did, the movement controlled, his eyes briefly scanning the documents on the desk before returning to her face. "Word travels fast," he added, a faint, almost restrained smile touching the edge of his expression. Ava did not smile back, but her gaze softened just slightly. "It always does," she said. There was a brief pause, not awkward, but reflective, the kind that allows truth to surface without being forced. Mitchell leaned forward just a fraction, resting his hands lightly on his knees. "The situation downstairs," he began carefully, choosing his words with precision. "It is already being discussed." Ava nodded once, unsurprised. "It should be," she replied. Her tone remained even, not critical, not defensive, simply acknowledging what was inevitable. Mitchell studied her for a moment, then asked, "How would you like it handled?" Ava's eyes moved briefly toward the window again, the reflection of light shifting across the glass, then back to him. "Not as punishment," she said, her voice calm but firm. "As correction." The words settled into the room with quiet weight. Mitchell nodded slowly, understanding forming without further explanation. "Training," she continued, "not just protocol, but awareness. The difference between enforcing rules and assuming judgment." Mitchell leaned back slightly, absorbing the statement, then nodded again, this time with more certainty. "Understood." Ava glanced down at the documents spread across her desk, then back up. "We do not fix systems by removing people," she said. "We fix them by changing how they see." The room fell quiet again, not with tension, but with clarity, the kind that follows a decision already made. Mitchell stood after a moment, straightening his jacket. "I will take care of it," he said. Ava gave a small nod. "Thank you." He turned toward the door, then paused briefly, his hand resting on the handle. "For what it is worth," he added, without turning back, "you were right to walk in the way you did." Ava did not respond immediately. Instead, she watched the light shift across the desk, then said quietly, "I did not walk in to prove anything." Mitchell opened the door, stepping out into the corridor, leaving it slightly ajar behind him. Ava's voice followed, soft but clear. "I walked in because I belong here." The door closed gently, and the office returned to silence, not empty, but settled, the kind of silence that does not ask questions, only holds the truth that has already been spoken. Late afternoon lights stretched across the office in long, quiet bands, shifting slowly as the sun moved behind the skyline, softening the sharp edges of glass and steel into something warmer, almost reflective. Ava Carter remained seated at her desk, the documents now organized into precise stacks, each one reviewed, marked, understood, the work moving forward without announcement, without interruption. The building around her had settled into a new rhythm, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, like a system adjusting its balance after a subtle but permanent shift. Downstairs, the lobby continued its routine, people entering, scanning, passing through, but the tone had changed in ways that could not be easily measured. Mark Reynolds stood at his post, the same uniform, the same position, yet something in his presence had quieted, not diminished, but refined. His movements were still efficient, still practiced, but now guided by something deeper than habit. A woman approached the counter, her hands slightly uncertain as she placed her bag on the scanner, her eyes flicking up briefly, then away. Mark met her gaze for a moment, offering a small nod, not commanding, not dismissive, just acknowledging. "You are all set," he said after the scan cleared, his voice calm, steady, without edge. She nodded back, a faint sense of relief passing through her expression before she moved on. The line continued, each interaction simple, routine, yet carried out with a quiet awareness that had not been there before. The polished floor reflected the movement of people, the overhead lights tracing soft patterns beneath their steps, the entire space functioning as it always had, but no longer blind to the weight of how it functioned. Mark's hand rested briefly on the counter again, the cool surface grounding him, reminding him of the moment earlier, not as a mistake to erase, but as a point of clarity he could not unlearn. He glanced once toward the secured doors, the path Ava had taken now empty, yet still present in his mind, not as an interruption, but as a correction that had reshaped something fundamental. Upstairs, Ava stood from her chair and walked toward the window, her reflection faint in the glass as the city moved beyond it, cars threading through streets, people crossing intersections, countless lives continuing without pause. She placed her hand lightly against the window frame, feeling the stillness inside compared to the motion outside, the contrast quiet but meaningful. Behind her, the office remained composed, the nameplate on the door catching the last of the light, the engraved letters holding steady, no longer just a title, but a presence that had already begun to influence everything around it. She did not smile. She did not speak. She simply stood there, breathing evenly, grounded in a space she had claimed not by force, not by announcement, but by truth. Down below, Mark adjusted his stance slightly, shoulders settling into a posture that no longer relied on assumption, but on awareness. And as another person approached the counter, he met them the same way, not as a threat to evaluate, but as someone to see clearly before anything else. The building remained quiet in its structure, efficient in its design, but within that structure, something had shifted, something that could not be reversed or ignored. And as the evening light faded into a softer gray, the reflection of the glass walls held more than just images of movement. It held the quiet imprint of a moment when power met humanity, and instead of clashing, it revealed what had always been there, waiting to be seen.